Katie Bunn-Marcuse is our next speaker. She's Associate Director of the Bill Holmes Center at the Burke Museum. She is co-author of the book In the Spirit of the Ancestors, Contemporary Northwest Coast Art at the Burke Museum. She specializes in the art of the Northwest Coast tribes, and at previous clan conferences she's talked about her research on Northwest Coast jewelry. So without further ado, here's Katie Bunn-Marcuse.
Thank you, Steve. It's wonderful to be here in Tlingit territory. I want to say thank you to the Atkwan and Taku Kwan for making me feel so welcome, and thank you for organizing this. And it's really an honor for me to be in a session dedicated to Bill Holmes, and like so many other people we've heard from today, I would not be doing the work I do in the manner that I do it without his influence and his introduction into this amazing world. So as Steve said, I'm Katie Bunn-Marcuse, and I'm the Associate Director of the Bill Holmes Center for the Study of Northwest Native Art at the Burke Museum. And before I launch into my paper, I have to give a little advertising plug. Steve very nicely already plugged the new edition of Bill Holmes' book, which is now has all color diagrams and photographs. But we are also having a fundraiser for the Bill Holmes Center publication series. And what we are hoping is that we have this wonderful, wonderful special edition of this book, which comes in a gorgeous black slipcover with copper cover art. And what's really special about it is it's a limited edition of 200. They're all signed by Bill Holmes. And he gave a painting that he put into Robin Wright's original 1965 book. He made a drawing for her that he put in her end papers, and he allowed us to take that drawing and put it into the end papers of this special edition. So if you would like to buy one, and the funds would go to raise money for the Bill Holmes Center publication series, you can go to this website, or you can get that from me afterwards, and we would very much appreciate your support. So thank you for letting me say that. So I'm going to talk about Here and Now, Native Artists Inspired, which was a show at the Burke Museum. It was up for 8 months last year. It included 60 pieces of new works on loan from artists and historical artworks from the Burke Museum collections. So I want to start with an exploration of what happens behind the scenes at the Burke Museum, and what we wanted to show in the exhibit was to show what is it that happens behind the scenes at the Burke and the results of those things. So although art making is flourishing in many Native communities on the Northwest Coast, in other places there are few teachers and fewer objects from which to learn. Some artists work in isolation without knowledgeable mentors or the critical resources that can inform their artistic practice. So for the past 10 years, the Bill Holmes Center has tried to bridge that gap. Through our grant program, we connect emerging artists with established artists through workshops and mentorships, and we provide artists and scholars with hands-on learning opportunities for studying historical art in person. The objects in the Burke's collection are imbued with the knowledge of their makers, and they can be a catalyst for transferring that knowledge across generations of artists. While some contemporary artists are committed to making faithful works that are faithful to long-standing aesthetic forms, others use historic objects as jumping-off points for exploring new artistic expressions. So Steve really actually did this part of my paper for me already, which is with the founding of the Burke Museum in 1885. The Burke's been collecting and caring for Northwest Coast art for over 100 years. But during Bill Holmes' time as curator from 1960s to 1980s, he always facilitated artists and scholars coming into the collections. I think you've kind of told this story, but I'm going to let Robin Wright tell this story herself.
You know, I started thinking about creating a Bill Holmes Center back in the late 90s, early 2000s. Part of Bill Holmes' legacy is that he always had an open door for anyone who would walk in off the street wanting to know more about an object that they may have found in their grandmother's attic or something that their family had owned for a long time. And he would always welcome them in and invite them to come into the back and look at similar objects. And so we thought a great thing to do would be to fund artists and other researchers who could keep coming into the Burke and have very open access to the collections.
There's never that feeling of that it's not all right for me to come back and look at these things. It's just, when can the doors be open?
Each year, the Bill Holmes Center gives grants to artists and researchers to work with the collections at the Burke. Our grant program has had a number of options in recent years, so we provide funding for artists to come and spend time in the collection. We have done workshops, funded workshops like this one with Rico Worrell at the Sheldon Jackson Museum, where he was teaching formline art through skateboard decks to youth. And this year we have we've funded artists going to other museum collections to look at their collections. And this year we have a new workshop format, which is called a collections-based workshop. And what it is that artists come with their with a class of young emerging artists, and they study the historical collections on site. They also have a day of doing a workshop on site. And then the lead artist will identify a certain number of pieces from our collection, and then our outreach staff packs those up and takes them out to the community where they can do an additional workshop in the community with a certain number of those objects from the museum. And that way more people can attend who maybe they weren't able to travel to the museum, or they're not comfortable coming to the museum, or other members of the community who aren't part of the workshop can come and see the historic objects. Currently, that's going to be in place for Washington and Oregon groups, but I'm hoping that we'll be able to extend that further in future years. So over the last 10 years, the Bill Holmes Center has given out over 130 grants to 130 people. We've really grown a lot just in the last 3 years. So you can see just from 2011, we've really expanded our grant program. But what I want to mention today is what the public wants. So the public is very interested in what goes on behind the scenes. And you can see from these are the same 3 years, 2012 to 2015, that people want to come and see behind the collections. And so we have a few we have a behind the scenes night, and we have a few other opportunities that the public can come in and just get a glimpse behind the scenes. It's not a research visit. And then this other little bar graph shows that of those people, the public visitors, pretty consistently 20% of those are Indigenous visitors. So people are very excited to come back and see what those collections are that are not publicly on view. So the heart of the Bill Holmes Center grant program are these artist visits to collections. They begin with a group of artists viewing maybe up to 100 pieces over the course of 3 days. Usually the visits are a day of travel on either end and 3 days at the museum in the middle. Many people see about 100 objects over 3 days, although usually textile artists look at far, far fewer for a greater time studying an individual piece. Really, the power of the artworks is made perceptible when people gather around them, when they're sharing stories and songs and reminiscences. And for the artists and researchers who visit us, it's really the table in our study area that's the site of just a lot of learning and laughter and a place to connect with past generations. So while artists can't apprentice with a master from generations back, the artworks themselves can be the teachers. So one example of these personal experiences, Shken George came to visit and did her research there, and she shared this story of her visit her visit to the weavings in the Burke's collection. And she said, and this is a quote from an interview that she did with us, that when she was there at the Burke looking at the robes, she felt really connected to the weavers that made them. Sorry, I'm going to read the quote. I found myself a lot of the time wondering who were these women that made these and where did they come from? And I just came up with a lot of questions and just a lot of wondering about where they came from and who they were, and admiration for their work. Sometimes feeling badly, I wish that I had been born earlier to be able to learn from them directly. There was one piece that I was looking at it really closely, and you could see a hair woven in it. And I just thought, there's a piece of the woman who made this, and you could see that it was all woven in like it had just gotten caught while she was making it, or maybe spinning the warp. And just seeing that made me feel like that person was there. So it can be a very emotional visit. It's wonderful when a group of artists come together, they can provide support for that. Other artists have had similar experiences. LuAnn Neil didn't know she knew some of her family's pieces were going to be in our collection, but she unexpectedly ran into pieces by both her grandmother and great-grandmother, grandmother and great-grandfather. And it just demonstrates again and again that these pieces are very personal documents of history and kinship, as well as being incredible artworks. Several years ago, as we were approaching the 10th anniversary of the Bill Holmes Center, we wanted to gauge the real-world effects of this grant program. So we contacted all the people who had received grants, and we asked them to share with us how their artistic practice had been affected by their visit to the Burke. So many of them told us about new pieces that they had made that had been inspired or informed by the historic works in our collection. So we created an exhibit, Here and Now, Native Artists Inspired, to showcase their artwork alongside the pieces from the Burke that they identified as being key to their learning, and to share the conversations with collections, that's sort of how I thought about it, that each of these artists had. There were 14 Northwest Native artists featured in the exhibit, and they loaned us the new works, which we put on view with the old pieces. So the show included their 30 new works paired with 25 19th and early 20th century pieces from the Burke's collection. Of the 14 artists in the show, 7 of them were Native Alaskans. There were 4 Tlingit artists, 2 Tsimshian, 1 Kenaitze, and in addition, there were 2 Haida artists, 1 Newhalk artist, 2 Kwakwaka'wakw artists, 1 Squamish, and 1 Wasco Columbia River artist, and hopefully you can read all their names up here on the screen. So the fact that there were fully half the exhibit was Native Alaskans shows that there's been really wonderful relationships between BC and Native Alaskan artists and the Burke Museum. It's also where the strength of our collection lies, and so part of this presentation is a pitch. I have little brochures here, so pass them out to your friends, encourage them to apply. We really want to keep this wonderful relationship going and people to come down and use the collections because that's what they're there for. And as a note, 40% of the artists in the show were women, which I think is not typical of a Northwest Coast art show, particularly, if it's not a weaving show or a basketry show. So that was very nice. So in preparation for the exhibit, artists engaged in recorded conversations with the exhibit team, during which they described their artwork and their creative process and the role of the Burke's collection in their learning journey. Excerpts from some of these conversations formed exhibit labels. We also had big quotes on the wall. You'll see some quotes on these slides going by. We also had audio files in a few places where you could listen to the artists tell their story about the pieces, the pair of works. So all that text and all the labels and audio, those were all approved by the participating artists. The exhibit reflected the multiple ways artists engage with the Burke collections. So some artists created pieces that were based on the artwork of previous generation, like David Boxley's very faithful replication of this old Tsimshian feast dish. This was on exhibit, the old and the new in the Here and Now exhibit. And he made a second one of these that's been in the Soboleff exhibit here. Just the one face on the end is a little bit different. David Robert Boxley made a new version of an old Tsimshian puppet in the collection. And he wanted to spend time thinking about the possible ways, the use of dramatic props like this in ceremony and what that might be useful for today. While many of the artists who use the Burke's collections are focused on working in forms and techniques closely tied to long-standing Northwest Coast art practices, others engage with the collection to answer a different set of questions that they're posing in their current art practice. Making sure that artists know that the collections are there for them to engage with on their own terms for inspiration in whatever their artistic journey is, that's a key part of our mission. Having artists in the Here and Now exhibit whose expression ranged from close reinterpretation of past pieces, like David Boxley's, to the abstract paintings. This is what Sonia Sue did after spending time with the Chilkat pattern board in our collection. Having that range of expression in the exhibit allowed the public to see that contemporary artists, all of whom are engaging with the material culture of their heritage, have a vast range of artistic expression, artistic responses to that experience. Lisa Telford's Pocahida was one of the highlights of the show. This was a piece that she wove as a challenge to herself and in response to a challenge from a curator at the Museum of Art and Design, David McFadden, who was pushing her to make something entirely new. And she was sort of saying, I'm really very traditional, I'm not comfortable with that. But she picked up a dress form at a garage sale, and she started to get inspired to think about what she could make based on her knowledge of cedar bark weaving. But then how would that have to change, because you don't have the straight line of the cedar bark clothing gravity loom, and what would she do to sort of work with this dress form? And she went on, she made this dress and a couple of bustiers and some other pieces, and then she made these high heels in responses to, and the loafers, both, in response to seeing these older shoes in the Burke collection. Alison Bremner's Raven's Cloak hung in the front gallery of the exhibit just past Telford's evening gown, and between a Chilkat robe and an old Tlingit beaded octopus bag and tunic. And here you can see the old octopus bag and tunic. When we interviewed Alison, she was just finishing her cloak and told us a little bit about the artistic process for the cloak. So I'm going to play a little chunk of that interview, and I appreciate Alison's letting me do that.
Yeah, I'm currently making a button blanket style blanket called Raven's Cloak, and it is my interpretation of the evolution of regalia. During my time at the Burke, I was fortunate enough to see a wide range of regalia there was a Chilkat blanket from Yakutat, a children's blanket, Chief Shake's tunic, and then we pulled this octopus bag, which is phenomenal and one of my favorite pieces. And I was really impressed by just the energy I got from the pieces. The craftsmanship was fantastic as well, but when Justin lifted the paper up off of Chief Shake's tunic, I was just hit with this, I could just feel the energy, and I would imagine that was the intention of the artist, and I think the artist who made it would be proud to know that it still carries that feeling all these years later. So I wanted to honor the old style of regalia, but also continue it as if Western contact with Western civilization hadn't hindered our artwork, so as if the artwork continued on. So I wanted to create a blanket which was influenced by the old style, but was something that Raven would maybe wear today.
And you can't see it in this shot, but the little gray beads that are featured in this octopus bag, Alison used those all along with at the edge of the applique on this blanket, so it has this incredible sort of glimmer along the edges of the sewing, and it's just cut and sewn with unbelievable precision. Several artists had identified pieces that were key to their learning, and serendipitously for the exhibit, these reinforced the themes across the exhibit. So for instance, both Alison Bremner and Shken George picked this octopus bag as their favored piece. Alison won the coin toss, and so then Shken picked this tunic to go with hers. And then Sonia Sue had picked the Chilkat pattern board that you can see in the back here, and Evelyn Vanderhoop had picked this big robe to go in the exhibit. So it was unbelievable when we were laying out the exhibit that this sort of conversation went between all the pieces and between what all these individual artists who were not talking to each other, but the sort of the power that all these pieces had in conversation with each other. And what I loved was that I thought that it showed the public this sort of more fully realized story for each artist, and they could see that continuum, how historical pieces are really a grounding place for artists working in all media. So these are just a few of the artworks and stories that were shared in the exhibit, and I won't tell any more individual stories, but just to show you a few other pieces, Joel Isaacs He was looking at old salmon skin bags and skin clothing, and here's his salmon skin boots with faces pressed into them. Tommy Joseph's new armor, which I think many of us, you here, are very familiar with. LuAnn Neil made a new salmon wall hanging inspired by this old Kwakwaka'wakw apron in the exhibit. There were others, Latham Mack, and there were a number of other people in the exhibit. So here and now, Native Artists Inspired allow Burke visitors to see that the work that goes on, behind the scenes. We hoped to reflect the current relationship between museums and Indigenous communities, where there's a collaborative support for inquiries about cultural knowledge. These relationships are a conscious reaction to the past, when museum collection practices often interrupted material culture production and really damaged Indigenous communities. By bringing what goes on behind the scenes to the front of the house, the exhibit revealed the relevance of the historic collections and the collaborative work to all of our stakeholders, including artists, communities, scholars, and the general public. Museums have a very stingy reputation of only having a small percentage of their artwork on view, and that's deserved. It's true. But one of the goals of this exhibit was to explain the benefit of having collections that aren't on view. They have another purpose besides being part of a publicly available exhibit. So to that end, we put this chest out. There's a number of pieces in our collection that are requested over and over and over by different artists. I sort of think of them as these mentor pieces in our collection, and it's often out on the study table, and it serves as a teaching tool for emerging artists and their mentors. It's not serving in the capacity for which it was originally made, but it has a new role these days as a teacher. So I'm going to give Evelyn Vanderhoop the last word today.
It's been 230 years since contact with outside world. And all of the changes that our culture has now have caused an erosion of the apprenticeship system. The Burke holds these objects, and these are the energies of our ancestors are sitting right here. And so studying like this is an extension of our apprenticeship with our ancestors, and that's very important.
So the objects in our collection are not locked away for posterities. It's a working collection. It serves artists and researchers who literally physically connect with the artists connect with the artworks to maintain a continuum of knowledge and creativity that spans the generations. So I hope that we will be able to see some of you at the Burke, and I have brochures if anyone wants them. Thank you very much.